Okay, last week I was so disappointed with myself that I went home and I made another chart. One I want you to have in your mind, an image in your mind. This is what you looked at last week. It's a fair representation, I suppose, but it's not good. The main point is that what you see here is that salvation through faith has always been that way since the beginning of time. That's the way it's going to be to the end of time, um, based on moral law rather than uh, ceremonial laws. We think sometimes of law as baptism, the Lord's Supper, and that is law. But the moral law is the weightier matter of law, is the moral code. And the reason for that is because it's rooted in the very nature of God Himself. God is love. God is holy. God is just. Uh, these things, we being made in the image of God, therefore, we are to develop these attributes uh, in our quest to become more and more like God. Uh, it's always been this way. It's not something new. It's not unique to the New Testament. It's always been this way. God doesn't change. We know that. We read it in the Bible. We know it's true. And that's why the law can't change. It can't change. It's rooted in its nature. It has to stay the same. That's why we can be certain that it is, even though some brethren disagree with me on this. I still believe I know this is correct, so I don't budge. The ceremonial law is the part that does change. Why? It has nothing to do with the nature of God. It's what God commanded. This is what people were supposed to do by divine edict. And God can change law when He chooses to do so, just like people do. Our laws change all the time, uh, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but they do change. And we ought to realize that. What I'd rather have you, the image in your mind, I'd rather have you have is Old Testament history. It lasted about 4,004 years. It commenced with the patriarchs, beginning with Adam, the first patriarch. Patriarch basically means it's a family rule, where the father is the priest of the family. He's the go-to guy. If you have a sacrifice you need to offer, you go to the father, the head of the tribe. This is the man that does the sacrificing on your behalf. He's the one through whom God speaks. He talks to this person, and then this person conveys the divine will to others. This is the way it was originally established. I call it ceremonial law number one. That's just my term for it, so I can talk about it with you. There wasn't a name. It was just there was a law, and the law was, I suppose, different from family to family. I don't. It wasn't a universal law by any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't think. Certain people were, well, for example, Abraham. He was ordered to offer up Isaac. No one else was. It was just Abraham. Okay, he was bound by that law, but no one else was. So the Lord, um, he could give a rule. That's what a law is, a rule of conduct. He could give a rule to one family, and another family might have a slightly different rule. There were some rules that never changed. They were consistent, such as animal sacrifice. It had to be done. The people had to learn that blood and sin had a connection with each other. Okay, the idea of a blood sacrifice every year was that this was a type of atonement for sin. And they had to understand that in order to atone for sin, blood had to be offered. But they knew that the blood of animals wasn't going to get the job done because they had to repeat this every year. But the thing that they did learn through those 4,000 years was the connection between blood and sin. And finally, that's going to be manifest in the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, the Lamb without a blemish whatsoever, God who offered himself up on the cross and shed his blood in order to make it possible for God to forgive sin. He couldn't forgive sin before Jesus' blood was shed. That's something he could not do. If he did, he would have violated his own holiness, and he couldn't do it. He rolled their sins forward year by year by year, knowing that ultimately the debt would be paid, but it was always in anticipation of what God knew. He knew the end from the beginning. He knew that Jesus was going to be offered up as an atonement. So this was the rule that governed humanity throughout the 4,004 years, according to Bishop Ussher. That's somewhat debatable in my world. But during this period of time, this was the system that people lived under. Now, along about 1500 BC, things changed. The Lord said to Moses, "You come over here. I want you to go get the people out of Israel, and I want you to take them into the land of Canaan. I'm going to separate them from the world. They're going to change." He did take them out of the world, so to speak, figuratively speaking, by Moses. I got Moses. He's the primary. The prophets, of course, are very important, but it was about Moses. He was the leader of Israel's becoming a state. So you got Moses, who led Israel out from the world. God sent him to Egypt, and there was a reason for that too. The Egyptians wouldn't have anything to do with Hebrews. They just kind of turned their nose up at Hebrews. The Canaanites, where they would ultimately go, the Canaanites would have married them. The Egyptians, there's no way Egyptians going to marry him. Even Joseph, when he was the second man in charge of Egypt, they didn't eat with him. He was a stinking Hebrew, and they didn't eat with stinking Hebrews. So the Lord sent them to Egypt because no one was going to marry a Hebrew, and they could keep their bloodline pure during the time that they stayed there in Egypt. Of course, he gave their constitution, their law. Salvation through faith was a given. That never changed. They had grown up under such a law, even though they probably didn't know what it was any longer. The whole world just about had strayed away from the Lord. There were pockets of people who remained faithful to God, but not very many. The world, for the most part, was filled with sin, something like it was in the days of Noah. Remember? In the days of Noah, everybody was given to sin, so God took Noah and separated his family from the world. Well, the same thing's happening now. The world is once again filled with sin. And God this time is choosing Moses to deliver Israel. And this time he would do it by making them a state, which he did. But salvation through faith was still true because it's an eternal law. It's not going to end. And then they come under what I call ceremonial law number 2. I don't like the designations at all, but I don't know what else to do to talk about it. But mostly when you read the New Testament, what you're going to see, what I call here ceremonial law number 2, you're going to see it referred to just as the law. That's all, just the law. Now, the reason this is important is because when you read the New Testament, there's much ado said about the law being non-consequential. And when many preachers, and I hope the preachers that are watching this are paying attention, Many preachers, when they read about the law, they equate it with works. The law is non-consequential. Works are non-consequential. That's not what the law means. When you read about the law in, say, Paul's writings, that's where it's mostly predominant. When you read about the law, most of the time, the law. When the article's in front of the law, you got the law. Most of the time, it's a reference to the law of Moses. That's how they referred to it. It was just the law. It was the only law they knew up until Christ. They didn't know any other law. They had been raised under it, and they just simply called it the law, okay? So remember that when you read Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all of them. When you read about the law, you're talking about the law of Moses. You're not necessarily talking about law in general, though there are times when you read about the law in general. But most of the time, I would say in the Pauline epistles, it's probably the law of Moses that he's alluding to. Context will tell you. All you got to do is look at the context, and you'll figure out which one it is, whether the law in general or the law of Moses. One of the main differences between these two groups, for example, regarding ceremonial law, was that under the patriarchal way of doing things, the father being the head of the tribe, or clan, whatever you want to call it, was priesthood. Since Adam until Christ, it had always been the head of the clan, the patriarch of the family. This was the person, he was kind of a high priest. He would offer up atonement, sacrifice for his descendants under him. When you get into the law of Moses, that changed, you remember. God said for the tribe of Levi to become the priests, okay? And there would be a high priest that would be elevated, which of course began with Aaron, and it would be his descendants from that point onward. And instead of going to your great-great-great-granddaddy with your problems, your need of forgiveness, you would go to the temple, you would go to the altar, and you would offer up your sacrifice through Levitical priests. That was one of the main differences of ceremonial law. See, the law changed from the patriarch to the tribe of Levi, a descendant of Jacob. Ultimately, the law would end and did end when Christ came into the world, and you have the new era or dispensation, Jesus Christ. You got the same moral code, nothing's changed, but what I call ceremonial law number 3, which, as you know, is of necessity, not of preference. Now, with this in mind, this new chart you're looking at, I want you to think about what Paul says. Just a couple places I want to reference to show you why it's important to understand. In Ephesians 2:14 and 16, Christ himself is our peace, who has made both one. Both what? You see, with the 3 circles, that the patriarchal era ended and the Mosaic economy began, then both of what? What are we talking about? It doesn't make any sense. I used to have so much problem with that. I grew up learning about the 3-circle thing, and it didn't make sense. Both of what? You've only got one law system, and that's the law of Moses. There isn't another law system. Oh, but there was another law system. As this chart bears out, you had the patriarchal system. You've got 2. You've got the patriarchal system. You've got the Mosaic system. Now it's starting to make a little sense. Christ himself is our peace. He has made both systems one. He has broken down the middle wall of separation, the wall of separation. Patriarchs, they didn't know anything. They didn't think of themselves as living under a law. God told them how they ought to behave themselves For the most part, they just disregarded what God said. Some people did, however, remain faithful to God, but they didn't think of themselves living under ceremonial law number one, okay? They were just, they were servants of God. They believed in God, and to the best of their ability, they tried to walk with God, okay? So when you talk about the middle wall, there was only one wall in everybody's mind, and that wall was going to be the law, okay? That was the wall that separated both Jew and Gentile, because it didn't take Gentiles into consideration. As far as the Jews was concerned, it was for them only. They were the only people that was going to be saved, but they were wrong. The law did separate the two groups, but Jesus took that wall out of the way. Okay, how did he do it? That's the question. He's abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances. They were written down, the law was, Commandment 1, Commandment 2, and so on and so forth, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace. One new man from the two, of course. You got the two, the patriarchal system and the Mosaic system, that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. So one of the main things that was accomplished through the death of our Lord is spelled out in Colossians 2:14 by Paul. Jesus wiped out the handwriting of requirements. That was, of course, the law of Moses. It was the only one written down that was against us. How could the law be against us? The law couldn't help us. If a person lived by the law perfectly, flawlessly, they would be saved, not because the law helped them, but because they helped themselves. Law doesn't help. It doesn't hurt. Law is just a dumb thing. It just stands there and looks at you. Go out there and look at a speed limit sign. It won't talk to you. It won't give you a cup of coffee. It's a law. That's all it is. It's 55. Now, what you do with that law, either you obey it and you aren't bothered by the state, or you break it and they'll take a couple $100 away from you. The choice belongs to you. The law has nothing to do with it, okay? So when he says the law was against us, the point is the law couldn't help us. There was nothing law could do for us. All it did was reveal sin. That's all law does. To reconcile both to God in one body, I'm on the wrong one, which was contrary to us, he has taken the law out of the way, having nailed it to his cross. Well, actually, both systems were nailed to the cross. The ceremonial law of each one of them, and for all practical purposes, they were dead. They ceased to exist when Christ was crucified. It's very important to understand. This is not understood by many of our brethren. They get into debates with denominational people, and they wind up looking silly because the denominational person is talking about something and is correct, and sometimes our brethren are incorrect, but they think they're correct. Their conclusion is right, but the way they get to it is wrong. And if you can't get to the conclusion the right way, no one's going to take you seriously. For somebody like me who does have debates with, let's say, religious leaders, I can't afford to be wrong. I have to be correct whenever I open my mouth. Because if I'm not and they prove me wrong, I lose my credibility, and I can't afford to do that. And that's what I want you to be able to do as well. When you open your mouth, I want you to know what you're talking about. I want you to understand. I want you to see a picture of it. And when you talk about it, you can talk intelligently. And if you talk intelligently about the matter, this matter in particular, the doing away with the old law. A lot of people believe you're still living under the Ten Commandments. Don't you know? How many people do you know that thinks we're still living under the Ten Commandments? And in Colossians 2:14, Paul made it crystal clear that the law was nailed to the cross. The moral law? Not the moral law. But the ceremonial law. What ceremonial law, for example, of the Ten Commandments doesn't exist today? The Sabbath, the fourth command. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. That was a ceremonial law. That's not a moral law. The moral laws, they continue because they're an eternal law. The Sabbath law, on the other hand, it died on the cross. No longer was people supposed to come together and worship God on Saturday. That all changed with the new covenant because it became the first day of the week, not the seventh day of the week. Now you can make that argument. It's not to be a show-off. It's just to know what you're talking about. That's important. It's important that we know what we're talking about, and we talk about it intelligently. The Bible's a very intelligent book. It's very logical. It's extremely reasonable. I was watching this morning, the Democrats, they're going to sue Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma is using the Bible as a textbook for history, a boost for history. They made it a law. And the Democrats are doing everything in their power to try to stop it. They're using the ACLU, the teachers' unions, and all that. Matter of fact, there's one county in Oklahoma. I don't know if it's a county or if it's the whole state. Anyway, the superintendent insists that when school starts up next week or so, they use the Bible as a textbook, and they're refusing to do it. Even though the state has determined that the Bible will be used, that they won't do it. They just say they're not going to do it. Now, you listen to these people on TV or politicians or whatever, they hardly ever know what they're talking about. But when it comes to the Bible, any scholarly historian that's credible, even atheists, will admit that the Bible contains the most historical record of times past than any book that exists. There are no mistakes, there are no errors. Now, they're not going to go that far. But when you come down to tracking what the Bible teaches, say Luke's writings in the book of Acts, one of the most famous books of all for historians, it never misses a lick, never misses a lick. There was one time in history someplace where Paul went, there was about a 30-year span where the ruler of that country was referred to by a different title, a different designation. In Luke's account, he calls the person who was the authority of the country, he calls them by the proper term. They used to laugh at him all the time. He invented a term. Now we know, because of archaeological finds, now we know that this is what the man was referred to. It only lasted for 30 years or so, where he was called by that. Luke hit the nail on the head. History books have to be revised every 7 years on average. The Bible, of course, has never been revised. It's precisely accurate. And when it comes down to American history, go back through the annals of history and find the people who were leaders of our nation and see how many of them didn't reference the Bible in their writings. Various quotes, how we ought to do, what we ought to do, who is actually in charge of this great nation. And you're going to find that most of our founding fathers, and even major events in our country, take Martin Luther King, for example. When he was in prison down in Alabama for his protesting, he referred to the imprisonment of Paul the Apostle, what it was like for Paul, what it was like for him, the similarities between the two. You can't escape biblical history when you talk about history if you're going to have an accurate record. They're teaching children to hate our country. They're telling children how evil our country is, how evil we are. The sins of our past, we've got to pay for them. Reparations, for example. We've got to pay for people because their ancestors were slaves. I remember one black man on television, he said, well, I never was a slave. I don't know why I should be paid. And I don't know of a single white person that ever owned a slave. I don't know why they should have to pay. He uses common sense. They called him Uncle Tom. But the man was just thinking sensibly, just common sense, nothing more. But these liberals and progressives, they want to destroy the Bible so much because the Bible is a big obstacle to their worldview. And they'll fight like crazy in Oklahoma to try to defeat it. I hope Tennessee does the same thing. I've signed petitions for it or written a letter in favor of using the Bible as a textbook in our great state. I hope we do. I hope all the red states do. And then hopefully we can beat them at the federal level. Because they're going to come up with something. They're going to shut down Oklahoma if other states don't come to the rescue. And they may shut it down then too. We seem to never win over the progressives. They own the federal bench, so it's a mess. Anyway, the handwriting requirements, the law of Moses, even the ceremonial law number 2, which didn't exist, they are dead, having been nailed to the cross for all practical purposes. All that's gone, okay? It's not a part of our history any longer. It's a history, not ours, okay? Our lives today are not based on their law. Their law's gone. The moral law, yeah, we still live under the moral law. Remember, God is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. It doesn't matter what Washington, D.C. says, God is in control. He is the authority, and he's the one that we are to live under. Well, with the two laws being gone, Jesus Christ, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, we still live according to the moral code, salvation through faith, and then ceremonial law number 3. We know it better as the New Covenant, or perhaps the New Testament. Okay, this is what we live under today. But when you understand how it actually worked, how Cornelius could be a Gentile worshiper of God, because he was still living according to the pattern of his fathers. He was a believer in God to the best of his ability. He tried to obey God, and in the eyes of God, that was very good. That was good for Cornelius. He was a just man. He was a good man. The problem was, under the new dispensation, he was not a saved man. Because under the new dispensation, now you had to have faith in Jesus Christ. That was the change that had to take place. And therefore, because he was such an outstanding character, according to God's estimation of him, he personally sent Peter to go talk to him and to help him become a New Testament Christian, which he did. All he needed to do was know what God's will was. And Cornelius was just the kind of man who would do whatever God wanted. But he did live under a different system than the Jews did. Okay? And the two became one. No longer two bodies, now you become one body. There's a lot of places in the New Testament where these references are made to two becoming one. And if you understand this chart, if you have an image of it in your mind, you can now make sense of those texts where two become one. I don't know how many think this way or do not. I don't know how well it would be received, but at least you'll know, and that's what's important to me, that you'll know the truth about the matter. Any questions? I know I put a whole lot on you. There's a whole lot to it. We're trying to tie the two testaments together, and that gets difficult sometimes. But maybe I made it easy enough to Did you understand it? If you tell me you didn't understand it, you know I'm going to come back next week and do it again. Well, anyway, we'll go on with our regular Bible class. Number 11, more on Paul's ministry, the purity of his motives, and his intended results, what he hoped to achieve. Knowing, therefore, the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. But we are well known to God, and I also trust are well known in the Corinthians, your consciences. You've seen us. We were with you for 18 months. You've seen us where we live. And you know us, in other words. We do not commend ourselves again to you. He's being, I think, just a tad facetious right here. The false teachers in Corinth and their devotees, you remember they had letters from Jerusalem saying what great people they were. Well, Paul, all he's got is to commend himself. Okay? He's got no letters from Jerusalem. All Paul can do is say, I'm a good guy. Okay? So he puts a little ironic twist there. We do not commend ourselves again to you, as they suggest. But we give you the opportunity to boast on our behalf. Take up for us. Oh, so many times, men's hearts are broken because the brethren will not back them up. If something is said against them, instead of coming to their defense, they just sit in silence. And one man stands out there by himself. Why won't brethren defend each other? I do not know, unless it's fear. Sometimes I think fear really gets in our face. But it's heartbreaking for the preacher who finds himself standing there alone. It appears that Paul was at this time in Corinth. While the false teachers and their devotees were saying lies about Paul, the brethren just stood there and let them have their way, let them talk. Paul says, we give you the opportunity. I'm not going to boast on myself. I'm not going to commend myself, but I'll give you the opportunity to boast on our behalf. You take up for it. You defend us. You were where we lived for a year and a half. You know us. And when somebody says, I, Paul, am a cheat, or I, Paul, am a deceiver, you people know I'm not a cheat or a deceiver. You may not like my looks, but when it comes to character, you know I'm not that kind of a person. Why don't you defend me? But they didn't, but they will. That's all going to change. That you may have an answer for those who boast in appearance and not in heart. They were after the money at Corinth. That's what it's all about, right? I mean, that's what makes the world go round. Burton always said, follow the money, follow the money. That stuck in my head since the first time he said it. Because it's true. You follow the money. If I was a crook and I wanted to get money, I would go where money is. I wouldn't stay here in Jackson County. I'd go where money is. I'd find the people who are willing to give the money. Well, you got to teach a certain thing. I don't care. I'm after the money. Tell me what you want me to teach. I'll teach it. You don't come out and say that, but that's what your attitude is. Give me the money, and I'll tell you what you want to hear. That's what these false prophets were doing in Corinth. That's why they were there. They came from Jerusalem. They pretended to be apostles, which they weren't, and they were raking in the money. Okay? They dressed good. Oh, Dan, they wore $2,000 suits, silk ties, gold cufflinks, had gold in their teeth. Every time they smile, it sparkle at you. They were truly men of God, because look at the blessings God had bestowed on them. They boast in appearance. On the other hand, there was Paul. What did Paul have? He had a bald head. According to a lot of historical records, he was ugly as sin. He's a little fella. He didn't wear good clothes. A lot of times he didn't have money. A lot of times he didn't have food. So you can imagine what he looked like, kind of like John the Baptist, I suppose. That's the way the preachers looked back in them days, the godly preachers. Because they weren't after money, they were after the souls of people. And they often compared themselves to Paul. Look at us, look at him. That's God's man? You got to be kidding. How can God's man look like a beggar? They boast in appearance, but not in heart. They didn't have the heart. Paul did. That's one thing they couldn't fake. They didn't love the people there at Corinth. They were using them for their own benefit. Not Paul. He didn't want their money. He didn't take their money. And I suppose that's the reason why he wouldn't take their money. He took money from other churches because he had to live. He didn't take money from Corinth because he didn't want them to think he was after their money. He had the heart. They didn't. They went by appearance. He went by heart. Corinthians knew it. They lived with him for 18 months. If we are beside ourselves, it is for God that we are beside ourselves. He wasn't beside himself. He was excited for the gospel. He was excited about salvation. He was excited about godliness. But he wasn't beside himself, though they said he was. If we are of a sound mind, it is for you. And he was of a sound mind. Very logical man. Very reasonable. Easy to understand. That they thought differently than we do today. They had a different background than we do today. It's a little more challenging for us than it was for them. Remember, we're reading a 2,000-year-old record, and it's very difficult to do to understand their custom and culture. For the love of Christ compels us because we judge thus. The love of Christ, because of our love for Christ, his love for us and our love for him, we are bound to love you as well. We are bound to do what the Lord would have us to do. I love Jesus so much, I want to make him happy, therefore I'm about his business. Basically is what Paul's suggesting. Whoa. Oh my. That if one died for all, then all died. We'll have to stop and take up here next week, God willing. Yeah. on VBS weekend, we're just going to carry on with our Bible class. We'll do a VBS sermon next week. I'll have to pause on the Sermon on the Mount to do a VBS sermon. But as far as Bible class goes, we'll just keep on with our Bible class. So I'll see you in a few minutes.